Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the series of lectures entitled On the Shoulders of Giants. Elizabeth had a look at the audience for today, and she mentioned that it might be some of you aren't familiar with NCETA. So allow me to steal 5 minutes of Shaun's time to tell you what NCETA is. So NCETA is the National Cancer Imaging Translation Accelerator. We focus on delivering imaging studies. So as part of NCETA, where we aim ultimately to produce quality controlled biomarkers at the end of studies, we do a lot of work around huge data sets. So our trials unit works closely with a quality assurance unit, a repository unit, and we also have education and training and engagement as part of NCETA. So several of you who've worked in drug trial settings or surgical trial settings will find our setup slightly different because we have to cope with images, DICOMs, sharing these without interfering with any kind of confidences. So that's what NCETA is. We run imaging trials. Why is NCETA running this series of lectures? COVID hit, and as the program manager, I was quite concerned that we might miss some of our educational milestones, educational lecture milestones. So I asked the governance group if we could run the series of lectures, and they very kindly humored me and said, yes, Chris, you can do this. So we invited, and indeed we picked individuals I think are giants in their fields. So we had Professor Michael Baum talk, we've had Professor Tom Treasure, Evis Sala and Karen Murphy did a bit on industry. We've had Heather Williams present as well, Leslie Fallowfield, and today we've got Shaun Treweek with us. So Shaun is a professor in health research services. He's actually in very good company because he's got a degree in physics and bioengineering, and a lot of images are physicists at heart. So he's at home here. Shaun is active in the field of delivering efficient study trial designs, particularly pragmatic trials, which is when you're looking at large studies, they do need to be pragmatic in design, means of improving recruitment, retention interventions, and all the wonderful things we dream of when we run large studies. So for a series of lectures where we've talked about how best to set trials up, how important it is to involve industry, how good it is to build in quality, it makes sense that the last of the series looks at the importance of diversity in trials and other health research studies. Therefore, I have great pleasure to introduce you to Professor Treweek. Shaun, thank you.
Thanks, Chris. That's brilliant. Many thanks. And I'll start by tracking down my slides, and then we can get on with that. Okay, so hopefully all of you can now see a purple slide there. So as Chris said, I'm going to talk about the importance of diversity in trials, and I'll try and touch upon other health research as we go on. But my disclaimer, if you like, is that I am a trial methodologist. So what I know best is trials. So that will be the focus. But I do think that most of what I talk about today will apply to any type of research. So I don't think this is something which is only relevant to trials. The big picture things that I say will most definitely apply to other types of research. Of that I have absolutely no doubt. But my background is trials, so that's what I know best. So I'm a designer of trials and think about how we make the decisions within those trials. So research design is clearly, as all of you will know, about making choices. And those choices are sometimes straightforward and sometimes they're really difficult. Judgment most definitely required, and compromise often required when making those design decisions. Some of those design decisions are absolutely fundamental in the sense that once that decision has been made, there is no way back, or a return from that decision is extremely hard, meaning essentially there is no way back from it. So we have to think as you know, very carefully about the consequences of our design decisions. And for trials, I would say a common place to make bad choices is around who is involved in the trial, who we involve not only as participants, patients say, but also in terms of the other staff and professionals, if you like, that we involve within our trial. I'm going to focus mostly on participants, patients, but it also refers, I think, more broadly to that and to other individuals, as we might see as we go on. But if we make a mistake with regard to our choice of participants, then that is one of those choices which I think is very, very hard to recover from. So if we have designed in some eligibility criteria and those criteria actually are not carefully thought through, or the consequences of those criteria not carefully thought through, then that can bake in inequality and also general irrelevance. So Chris mentioned in the opening statement about pragmatic trials, which is something I've worked in for a long time. And the individuals who came up with that term in the 60s really did talk about many trials being designed in such a way that they really do not provide or will not provide data that are relevant to people who you're hoping that trial is going to help. So they're irrelevant. They might be, they might look quite pretty, they might be beautifully done, but there are some choices that have been made right at the start that render those findings irrelevant. One reason for that being that the wrong people are involved in the trial, the wrong participants. Now, I'm going to focus quite a bit today on ethnicity because that's been a focus of my work for the last 4 years or so. So I'm going to give a couple of slides with some examples of where design decisions don't really seem to match what we think or should be thinking is the group of individuals who have most or much to gain from the therapy or treatment or initiative that we're evaluating. So this is just a few things that I've picked out. So the top one there is about type 2 diabetes. So here in the UK, if we think about who has type 2 diabetes, then a little bit over 10% of those individuals would have a background that we would describe as South Asian. So India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nepal, that region of the world. Individuals with that heritage are around about 11% of the type 2 diabetes population here in the UK. And what that suggests is that if you're doing a research study in type 2 diabetes, then that study should have a reasonable proportion, something perhaps like 10 or 11% or somewhat higher perhaps, but something like that, of individuals who would describe themselves as South Asian, because they are a group of individuals who get type 2 diabetes. And actually if you look across bunches of trials that are done and look at, well, what's the average involvement? And that's actually about half what we might anticipate if we were thinking about who actually has the condition and therefore who are the people who might gain most. So that suggests that there's a bit of a mismatch. We're not really thinking about who gets the condition and therefore who should be in our trials. These examples of trials. The next one is work that's ongoing, and it's by a colleague of mine called Talia Isaacs, led by a colleague of mine, Talia Isaacs, at University College London. And what she's looking at is language requirements in trials. So the eligibility criteria and language requirements. And what she was particularly interested in, she is a linguist herself, is how often do trials have must speak English or variants thereof as an explicit eligibility criterion. And what she has done is looked across just over 30 recent trials in 2 areas, depression and diabetes, and then looked to see whether they have explicit language restrictions. And just over half did. So these are explicit must speak English language restrictions. And this included trials of essentially cognitive behavioral talking-based therapies for depression. And if we were to look at who are the individuals who have depression or who have diabetes, then what we'll find is that many of those individuals who have these conditions do come from communities where at least some individuals may have challenges with regard to English as a language. They may be able to speak English, but they may prefer a different language. So what these criteria are likely to do is differentially exclude individuals from some ethnic groups. And the other note here that I've just flagged it with those depression studies is that the average proportion of participants by ethnicity was that 92% were white. And this includes conditions where we know, depression certainly, that many of the individuals do come from communities, ethnic minority communities, where language may, at least for some individuals, be more of a challenge. And therefore, by limiting inclusion explicitly by language, that predictably excludes some individuals who could benefit from this intervention in principle if we'd considered language. And what it's suggesting is that we might think, if one of these trials was successful, is, oh look, we've generated some evidence about an intervention that is effective, but it's not effective for everyone. It's effective for those individuals who are fluent in English, and that is not all of the individuals with depression, for example. So that's what we're trying to get across with these points, is that some of these criteria have a greater impact on some individuals than others. A couple more examples. So the first one is linked to data on overweight and obesity, so essentially epidemiological, I suppose, is that these data, a few years old now, 70% of adult Black individuals were either overweight or obese. And then there's a systematic review in 2013, which is quite old, but the reason I flag that is because it's part of the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence's guidance. So that review forms part of that guidance, linked to bariatric surgery for individuals who are severely obese. And the trials within that review, and therefore considered within that clinical guidance that's used here in the UK, of the 11 trials within it, only one of them even recorded ethnicity. So we don't know how acceptable or feasible that intervention is to groups other than, well, actually we don't know, they haven't even recorded ethnicity. And that, given the potential differences with regards to who gets the most severe condition or who has something to gain or benefit by ethnicity, it seems odd that our evidence base does not consider that there may be differences by ethnicity, given that where we look, we do very often find difference in terms of prevalence or severity of a condition. So there's a bit of a mismatch. And this last one is linked to smoking. This is just because of something I did in a talk last week. We were looking at a smoking, actually it's a smoking relapse prevention trial. So it's individuals who are smoking but have made a decision to stop, but have very recently made that decision. And this trial was about helping those individuals to remain non-smoking. And if you look at the ethnicity of smokers, the biggest group are individuals who would currently be categorized as mixed or other ethnicity here in the UK. But that trial recruited entirely from an English stop smoking service where fewer than 6% of users are ethnic minorities. So the biggest single groups, if you like, in the UK who are smokers are not majority white population. But the trial team chose a service as their recruitment starting point that is majority white users. So it restricts who can get into that trial. And again, means that whatever conclusions were to come out of that trial, we are very uncertain as to whether they hold relevance for groups who are not represented within the trial. So this is the sort of background with regards to ethnicity that is leading us to think about, do we need to change the way we design our research? And I've talked about ethnicity, but there are plenty of other underserved groups, and that term underserved is a term used by the National Institute for Health and Care Research, linked to an initiative that I'll mention in a moment. but we could think about people at socioeconomic disadvantage, people at age extremes, the very young, the very old, people with impaired capacity to consent, people with physical disabilities, mental disabilities. There are lots of groups of individuals who are routinely not involved in health research. And there is a list that NIHR provide of example groups of individuals who we routinely do not include and involve in our research, which opens up this question about the relevance of research to those individuals and the potential for persistent inequality because the output of research is not considering their perspectives. So in other words, I'm going to summarize and say that researchers, people like me, have traditionally thought more about how many people need to be in rather than who. And we think about clinical criteria, we're used to that. But what I'm starting to suggest now is that we should be thinking about what we might call sociodemographic criteria. Who are the people who bear the brunt of this particular illness or condition or problem? And they are the people we need to think about in our research. Now, we're all familiar with the fact that COVID has really shone a light on this. So because COVID is a global phenomenon, it happened in a very compressed time frame. It threw up problems that have been there for a very long time, but made them immediate and unignorable. But the National Institute for Health and Care Research knew about this problem pre-COVID and had started an initiative called Include, which was all about trying to ensure that the research it funds is more representative of all of those groups who have something to benefit from research. And they called these groups underserved, which came from work with underserved groups, that was the term that was preferred. And also at the same time as NIHR doing this, there was a group that I was involved with, which was more on the trial methodology side, thinking about what are the ways in which we could improve recruitment to trials, where should we be focusing some of our effort. And we came together in about 2018 to develop something called the Include Ethnicity Framework. And what we were wanting to do with this was help trialists and potentially other types of researcher think through the implications of their the disease area in which they're working, the thing that they want to test in their trial, and the delivery of their trial and the implications that might have for the ability of individuals from different ethnic groups to participate and stay involved in that trial. So it was to try and essentially help trialists think through at the design stage the consequences of their design decisions, plus list challenges that for example, the disease itself would present when it comes to involvement of different ethnic groups. So the framework itself is a two-part tool. And what we were really interested in are a couple of things. One was some general questions to get people thinking. And my experience from using this myself, and I would definitely put myself in the category of an individual who has not thought about this very much prior to about 4 years ago, not in any great detail, and now who thinks about it all the time. These questions are to get people who may not have thought these thoughts before, get them thinking. And then we have what we've called worksheets that actually provide much more detail in terms of the questions you need to think about. Here are some things you need to think about. Answer them as best you can for your particular trial. So the questions themselves were developed as part of a team effort. So I showed you a few people stood in the staircase, but it was a bigger group than that, about 40 individuals in total involved from across a range of networks and organizations. And we had funding from a group, two sets really of funding that helped us do that. The latter bit was COVID funding, and so COVID did help us finish this work off. So the part one, these key questions, these 4 ones, these are the ones that you just get your mind in motion, start thinking about this. So for your particular trial, the first question that everybody needs to ask, as you'll have already gathered from what I was saying earlier, So who should be in this trial? And that's really about prevalence and severity. Who are the people who have something to gain from your intervention, your initiative, your treatment, your new way of delivering care? Who are the people who have something to gain? And when we think about ethnicity, what is their ethnicity? Which are the ethnic groups that we think have something to gain from our intervention? And that's, we might talk about that later, but that's actually trickier than you might think. But let's start off with who should be in the trial, and we're particularly thinking of ethnicity. Now, having identified some individuals from different ethnic groups who are important to your trial, the next question to ask is, and are there things about our disease area, the condition, that individuals from these different ethnic groups may respond to differently? And what we're really thinking about here are things like the perception of that condition or stigma around that condition, willingness to see that condition is a problem in the same way that other groups might see that this is a problem. So are there things that just because of the condition itself, we know are likely to be a challenge to involve some of the individuals that we've identified in question one, individuals who we think would have something to gain from being in this trial, linked to the condition itself. We're not thinking about the trial at that stage, it's linked to the condition. So we can think about that. And then having thought about that, the idea is, oh, what about the intervention itself? So it might be a drug, or it might be some sort of cognitive behavioral therapy, it might be surgery. Are there things about it that might make it easier or harder for people to get involved? And it might be not only the thing itself, but where it's delivered, or who delivers it, or how it's delivered, or when it's delivered. Those sorts of things. Will that make it easier or harder for some people to be involved? And the final one is about the trial design itself. So things maybe about measurement, who makes the measurements, where are the measurements being made, how often are they done, what data are we collecting, for example, how long is the trial, how do people come into contact with the trial, things that you have built into your design that might make it easier or more difficult for some individuals of some ethnic groups to take part. So these questions are about just getting you thinking. And then the worksheets ask or provide a list of concrete questions. And one of the nice things, we did that consultation, we had about 40 people. And one of the nice things that I've found since we did this is probably almost 2 years ago now, since we first did this, is that having had lots of discussions with people since, from lots of different ethnic groups, generally speaking, the sorts of issues that people raise matched very nicely to questions that are already in this framework. So the sorts of things that people raise as being potentially issues that could affect some ethnic groups differently to other ethnic groups, they do come up in conversations that I have, and I'm generally very pleased to see that they're already in the ethnicity framework. So that consultation we had and the involvement of lots of different individuals from different ethnic groups, I think has given us something which is pretty good. There's always room for improvement, but the sorts of questions that it asks are the sorts of questions that I think flag up potential differences in these areas, the disease, the intervention, and the delivery of the trial. So pretty confident that we're tapping into something that is real and important. I'm going to give you a few examples now, just to show you the sorts of things that it throws up. So this is one little tiny snippet from a completed ethnicity framework, and it's for a trial called Prosper, which is a breast cancer trial. And it's actually to do with pain that women had after surgery. So it's a physiotherapy to try and reduce pain in women who've had breast cancer surgery. And this is just one question linked to the disease. And so it's asking the trial team, if they were doing this from scratch, we did it retrospectively, but if we were the trial team, how might the disease itself present differently? How might you see the disease differently in women from different ethnic groups? And what this little piece of information provides here, this is from literature and potentially from doing work with public contributors, but generally literature and maybe data we have available locally. But the best we can do with regards to what do we know, this is saying, okay, we know that age diagnosis can be different, and that means that we might see some ethnic group women at an earlier age than others, and that might lead to differences. Therefore, that is a difference in how people present. We might find that ethnic minority women, or some, are a bit younger than we might see from the majority population. That the tumors themselves, there is evidence that for Black women, those tumors are of a higher grade, so there's a difference in severity there. So that would be something to be aware of. But what we really wanted to find here was, is there any information about pain after surgery by ethnicity? And we could not find. Even though there's a systematic review on post-treatment shoulder pain, that actually ethnicity and race were not mentioned at all. And that is another thing we have found very often in trying to answer some of these questions. The data often do not mention ethnicity. So trialists are struggling to answer some of these questions. So the question is generally considered to be important. That's why I'm quite pleased that we're tapping into something important. But the answers to those questions are often really quite tricky to get because of a lack of data. So that's one example. I've got 3 of these. So this is the second. This is a diabetes trial. It's a drug trial. And because of the lack of data, one of the things we wanted to ask in the ethnicity framework was, how have people from the ethnic groups that you've highlighted as being important, how were they involved in this case, selecting or designing the intervention comparator? To what extent have you involved people who are like the people who you've identified as important? And in this particular trial, that was very unclear. It was very unclear whether they had involved actually any patient or public partners in guiding them with regard to the intervention and the comparator, and leading on to other questions, the design of the trial. It's possible that they were, but it wasn't clear with the documentation that was available. And one of the differences, of course, if people were using this for their own trials, of course, they would know that. They would know the answer. We have the caveat that we were doing this retrospectively, but it wasn't clear to us, but they may have been. And this is the last one of these examples. This is a cardiovascular trial. And what this question is about is how people find out about the trial. And the reason I put this one up is that the way that potential participants in this trial find out about the trial is almost certainly because a clinician or a member of the research team ask a person if they would like or be interested in taking part. And any recruitment process that relies on the discretion of a recruiter to approach someone is open to differentially not including some groups, ethnic groups, more often than others, depending on a whole range of features of both the participants and the recruiter, language being one, of course. But generally speaking, if recruitment is up to the recruiter, it's the discretion, I'm going to talk to that person about this, then there is scope for trial populations that do not reflect the range of ethnic groups that could benefit from that intervention. So who is doing the approaching and how that process is organized can lead to groups that do not really reflect the range of individuals, the diversity of individuals that could benefit from this intervention. So it's something to be very much aware of. I've talked about ethnicity, but there are some other frameworks coming. And one of the key things to note, or to remember rather, is that there are lots of groups who we have not represented well in our research, certainly trials. And 2 frameworks that are definitely coming, and in fact are almost available, is the Include Socioeconomic Disadvantage framework and the Include Impaired Capacity to Consent framework. So both of those have been finished essentially. So the first one, just to give you, so I'm not going to steal Heidi, Katie and friends thunder on this, but I'll give you a sneak preview to one part of it. So these are the three people who have led development of the socioeconomic disadvantage framework. And they have used, as part of the structuring of this work, something from the UK government's child poverty strategy, because it fitted very nicely with what the public contributors they were talking to felt was important from their perspective regarding things that will influence their decisions to engage with and stay engaged with a trial. And that was at least what the UK government strategy here called the 3 Ps: pockets, prospects, and place. Essentially money, things linked to perception of well-being and life chances, and then where people live. And what Katie and Heidi and Fran have done is they actually ask questions which are really quite similar to the ones in the ethnicity framework, but they ask trialists to think about, when giving your answer, think about the impact or the influence that pockets, prospects, and place may have for this trial on enabling people who are socioeconomically disadvantaged to engage with and stay engaged with your trial. So it's possible that for a particular question, none of these things may be influential, so it might not be seen as an issue. For other questions, it may be that one of them does, but not the others, and for other questions, perhaps all of them. But they've structured it in this way because that's what their public contributors said matched their own view of what they would think about when asked, do you want to take a part in trial? Or indeed, their view of whether they would even consider trials or research as being useful at all to them, given their income, their prospects and place. So it's the structure matches what public contributors have told them is relevant to their situation in life. And I'm just going to hint at this next one, which is the impaired capacity to consent framework, just to highlight that there is actually a launch on the 30th of November there. So there is something like this, a web session where the lead of this particular framework, Vicky Shepherd, together with others, will talk through this impaired capacity to consent. So it has a similar structure to the other two, but of course is focused on individuals with impaired capacity to consent. So it does have some differences, and some of the key differences between this framework and the other two are legal issues, because the people with impaired capacity to consent, trialists have to take account of legal requirements, perhaps to a greater extent with regards to consent. So legal issues come into this framework more than they have in the other two frameworks. What I should also say is you probably grasp this already, is that, well, there's already 3 of these. You've said there's a lot of underserved groups. Does that mean we'll have 40 of them eventually? That has been a worry from the very beginning, that we would end up with what is an overwhelming number of frameworks. So we do have a bit of work which is now looking at whether there is substantive overlap in these, which would allow us to make something that's a bit more efficient. So we always recognize that before we created any of these, we always recognize that there is this potential for inefficiency, but thought we would develop at least these 3 and then start to look across them, and also start to think about intersectionality and how it may not be sensible to think of only ethnicity, for example, but we might also need to think about other factors such as gender or impaired capacity to consent, socioeconomic status, for example. So that work is also starting, but right now recognize that there is that danger without doing that sort of work of having an awful lot of frameworks that trialists and others potentially really will struggle to engage with, simply because of the volume of potential work in dealing with all of them. But once you have done a framework, and let's say it was the ethnicity one, then the trial team will have a better idea of who needs to be in the trial and what the challenges those individuals may have in taking part. And that, once you've actually gone through that process and really engaged with this framework, you will be surprised. Or, I mean, I've always been surprised at the things I have discovered while doing that, and certainly the things I've discovered while talking to individuals who are from some of the groups that we've highlighted as being important. So that preparation process, doing the framework, really is something that will throw up things that you have not thought about before. It's absolutely my experience. And there has been some evaluation, so it's pretty new, the tool, but there has been some evaluation led by Lydia Morris and Peter Bauer in Manchester of the ethnicity framework. And they generally found that people quite liked it, but were worried about the work, the actual time and effort that is required to actually complete that framework. And one of the things that they highlighted in their finding is that there is a need for researchers, people like me, to recognize the time and funding that is required to do this well. And that means also to actually engage with ethnic groups that we may not have engaged with routinely in the past. So that takes time and it will take money. And for funders, therefore, to facilitate this by making that time, by making those resources available, making the money available, and recognizing that to do this well means that the research will take longer. So that I think is one of the key things that came out of that work. Researchers are if they're worried about anything, it's the time involved in doing this and the perception of that funders may have in terms of our grant submissions and our budgeting and duration setting of research. So there needs to be a joint recognition on both the research side and the funder side that doing this well needs money and will take time. There are some resources, so we're coming towards the end now of the talk. There are some resources available that could help populate, if you like, these ethnicity frameworks, and we'll do something similar for the other frameworks over time as well. So if you had a look at that website, you'd find some resources linked right now mainly to ethnicity, not only ethnicity, but mainly to ethnicity right now. And in due course, which I'm hoping will be is a matter of a few weeks, both the socioeconomic disadvantage framework and the impaired capacity consent framework will be available at the same site. So this is our sort of diversity site where those frameworks would be made available. So that's a few weeks for the two other frameworks that I mentioned. So to summarize, so this is the last slide. I think researchers, trialists definitely, researchers generally too, I think, do need to start thinking more explicitly about who are the people who can potentially benefit from the thing that I am testing or observing or doing. Who are the potential beneficiaries? And to think more broadly than clinical characteristics, but start to think a bit more about sociodemographic characteristics. And it's, I guess what follows from that is that we would then start to be concerned not only about how many people are in our study, but also, and who are those people? Do we have the right mix of individuals to enable us to say something meaningful for all the people who have something to benefit from our study? The second point here is a huge sort of light bulb for me, is that it genuinely is very hard to impossible to second guess some of the challenges that individuals from groups other than your own, and I don't just mean ethnic group there, but to imagine what life is like and what the decisions that people make, what the basis for those decisions are. It's very hard to do that. And I think that is one of the key reasons why trials have traditionally looked the way they have, because we have designed them very often from a perspective of somebody like me, middle class British here in the UK, white, and that design works pretty well for people like me. Once you're looking for other groups, then it's very hard to second guess what sorts of things we need to think about. We have to either find that information in the literature or ask directly, and asking directly, I think, is absolutely central. So part of this is, when doing those frameworks, is engaging with individuals from the groups that you identify as important, engaging directly to find out what they think. We think the frameworks can help. I'm pretty confident about the question, certainly for the ethnicity one, based on because we have done some evaluation and because had lots of conversations with people from different ethnic groups, but more evaluation is definitely needed. So we need to be reassured that these are really asking important questions and actually changing the way we design trials. So they are all still early, and we need to convince ourselves, I think, yet that these are really going to lead to design changes. But for the stage that they're at, I'm optimistic that they're at least asking the right sorts of questions. And this final point is, I think we should all compare our study population, people who we've got in our piece of research, with the population of people who might benefit, certainly at the beginning, but also then potentially at the end as well. And say, okay, well, who is in our piece of research, who we would have liked to have been in our research, and then interpret it with that in mind, so that we always start to think about what are the strengths and limitations of our population with regard to who is in the study. And that doesn't necessarily mean that a piece of work that doesn't include some groups is completely hopeless, but it needs to be interpreted with that in mind. And it still may well be an important piece of work if interpreted in the sense that, well, this looks like something promising for these individuals. We need more research to engage these individuals, because our work, we weren't able to. We think these are reasons why, but we weren't able to. So it's that more reflective interpretation, perhaps specifically thinking about who is in the study. And that is it from me. Thank you very much. Thank you for listening.